Hey everybody, let's see a show of hands. Who's ever listened to rock music in their life? This includes alternative rock, classic rock, heavy metal, punk, grunge, and every single other genre of rock. Now look around. See? That's most of you. Now how many of you guys know how rock music started? If you look around, that's not as many of you guys. And if you guys are listening to rock music, it might be helpful to know how it started so you can understand it and have a deeper appreciation for it. So, rock music mostly started in the 1950s, but we're going to start with what rock music was before then. This all starts in the 1940s. The music that was most popular was big band, blues, and jazz music. The big band and blues musicians started rock and roll music by adding more grit to their music. Muddy Waters was the first musician to do this, and he did this by bending the strings on his guitar to create a cry sound. So, rock and roll in the 1950s was a very popular genre, because before then there was music for adults and music for kids, but there wasn't really any music solely for teenagers, and rock and roll immediately filled this gap. So many of you guys may be wondering, how did rock and roll get its name? And if you weren't wondering that before, I bet you are now. As many of you guys probably know, there was a lot of racial tension between different cultures in the 1950s, and each culture had their own style of music. Rock and roll was a genre of music that brought them together, but it was mutually agreed it needed a new name that both cultures felt comfortable listening to. So, rock and roll, before it meant rock and roll how we know it today, was slang for intercourse. And teenagers started using this because it was their new edgy music, so they felt it needed a new edgy name. So parents didn't really know that rock and roll meant intercourse, and their kids were calling it that, so they started calling it that, and it just caught on. So this brings us to the 1960s, where you could say the trends were electric. There were microphones, electric guitars, amps, basses, keyboards, and so much more. So in the 1960s was a time where the government was changing, riots occurred, there was violence and segregation, and minorities were cast to the side. So musicians didn't really like how this was being run, so they wanted to change it. And they rebelled with this new music called psychedelic music. Psychedelic music was heavily impacted by narcotic usage, and it gave them the rebellion they wanted, but with some pretty high costs. Many musicians died way too young due to their narcotic usage. Jimi Hendrix died in the late 1970s due to his narcotic usage. Keith Moon died way too young in the early 1970s due to narcotic usage and a drug overdose. And that's not even all of them. So many musicians passed away. So the main goal of the 1970s was to get away from this peace-loving hippie music of the 1960s and the narcotic culture that went with it. So many musicians started to add emotional lyrics, distortion, and heavy guitar riffs to make their music unique. So do any of you guys remember the biggest change in the 1970s? It's a music that we now call punk. So punk music made it okay for women to write, record, play, and just create rock music. The Runaways were the first all-girl rock band that helped women feel more comfortable creating this music. So this brings us to the 1980s, where everything was split up into subgenres. So there was punk rock, hard rock, shock rock, glam rock, grunge, indie rock, and emo. And there was so many kinds of rock. And then this new rock created underground music scenes that created a heavier metal than heavy metal called thrash metal. So this brings us to the 1990s. There wasn't a lot of change from the 1980s, but some music hybrids did emerge. There was grunge, which was a hybrid of punk, hard rock, and heavy metal. So this music also created a less glamorous rock appearance. So musicians would have flannel, ragged jeans, and their hair long. Also, another big change in the 1990s was alternative rock. Alternative rock was a way of classifying old rock from new rock, but the old rock wasn't classic rock. It's a little confusing, but eventually it makes sense. So now that we think about it, rock music has changed a lot, especially for only being around for 67 years. So I bet now, when you guys listen to rock music, you guys will have a much deeper appreciation and understanding for it.